Got it.
There you go.
Here we go. All right, welcome everyone to the Brain Stimulation Journal Club. I am Judika Mehta. I am the new social media editor at the Journal of Brain Stimulation. I'm a professor at Texas Women's University, and one of my research focus is to use brain stimulation methodologies to improve communication outcomes in individuals in speech and language disorders. And I believe it's an incredible time to be in the field of brainstem, where researchers and clinicians from different scientific backgrounds, as you can see on the screen as well, are bringing their own disciplinary focus to inform and advance the field. And I'm very excited to be part of this journey. We will be holding the journal clubs on a regular basis, and we will be inviting authors from the Brainstem Journal to present their research, as well as provide a forum to have great conversations about everything brainstem. And I'm hoping you can join us in the future sessions as well. We are completely open to suggestions about developing a special project with students, postdoc, or even other scientific fields in our endeavor to spread the word about the brain stimulation and how to generate novel ideas and develop discussion. Also, do follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or any other social media sites that you informed about innovative trends about brain stimulation. So without further ado, I am going to invite Mark George and Harold Sackheim to get us going.
Harold, I defer to you.
You are mean. I was going to defer to Mark. Okay, well, I will just say a few words. This journal club and in particular this webinar are certainly part of an outreach of the journal Brain Stimulation, as is the International Brain Stimulation Conference, which we organize. The goal of the journal Brainstem was to become the premier journal in this space that embraces all forms of neuromodulation, any technology that essentially changes neural function on a local level. And that includes invasive and non-invasive technologies, as well as technologies that try to alter pharmacology on a local basis. Our field is exploding. At each of the international conferences, I've presented a slide that outlines how many papers per year are appearing for each of the main technologies. And technologies like TMS and DBS have about between 13 and 1,500 papers per year individually. As a field, we are now well over 5,000 papers a year being published in the field of brain stimulation. Obviously, the journal Brain Stimulation only publishes a small fraction of those, but we attempt to identify the work that is not only cutting edge, but that speaks to deep fundamental principles of brain stimulation. Now, with a field like brain stimulation, which is exploding and which is addressing fundamental clinical issues with new indications, whether it's in neurologic disease, psychiatric disease, the addictions, and basic understanding of how the brain operates, whether that pertains to affective, cognitive, and other domains, a host of ethical issues emerge. We have powers that we've never had before in changing human behavior. We can, in a fairly direct way, impact on neural circuitry with methods that weren't in existence 10 years ago. So for one example is one of my, in fact, fervent hopes is that ultimately we as a field in treating psychiatric disorders will no longer simply be treating symptomatic manifestations, as we say, suppressing symptoms, but getting more towards root causes, which are basically going to be issues of personality, the ability to be resilient, to withstand stress, and so on. And will that involve essentially altering who we are as people in some fundamental sense? These undoubtedly are the types of issues that will emerge in our field as we learn more and more about what we can do and what we can't do. So I think this particular conference and the folks who have organized it are very, very special and central to the mission of our journal. And I will now turn it over back to you.
Thank you so much. I think that is very pertinent, very germane to the discussion that we are planning on having this afternoon. Mark George, would you mind adding to the whole what Harold started us off with?
Yeah, just briefly. So I love the journal club. One of the problems with the journal is it's just flat. It's two-dimensional. Manuscripts are submitted, they're reviewed by a few peers, and then we publish them, and then people read them, and we may have a little bit of correspondence in a letter or two, but it's really two-dimensional. It's flat, and I've struggled with how do you make the journal get much more spread and dynamic and back and forth and complex. And so I've wondered about having journal clubs or little discussions for every paper that's published. And so this idea of journal clubs for topics is really a great step in that direction to make the staid old black and white pages become real and living and get people involved. So I'm really in favor of this. I was an undergraduate philosophy major, and I've always been interested in ethics. That was my minor, and I've seen how brain stimulation methods really bump up against so many different ethical issues. And we've, in the journal, not really done a great job of addressing those formally, talking about those. The journal has been massively successful in many, many domains, but I don't think we've been successful in being the leading voice or organizing thought or organizing the thought leaders in the areas of neuroethics or the ethics of brain stimulation or the ethics around brain stimulation methods. And so I would love for this to be the first step in a whole new direction. So with that, I'll stop and listen.
Thank you so much. And Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Well, I'm absolutely delighted to be here. Thank you very much. I'm also very excited about the same direction that Mark and Harold are excited about, and the opportunity to work with all of you to understand what this community needs by way of neuroethics, what would best serve this community. So I think a good place for us to start would be just to have a quick introduction of me and Jim Giordano, who's also on the line here, and also Maram Vixen. Together, the four of us with Shirley Fecteau are involved in this special issue, and this is what brought us all together initially. And it's from this initiative that Maram and Shirley put forward for a special issue on ethical legal issues that we together, all of us, cooked up this idea of speaking to you at this journal club. So just a quick little introduction from me. I'm a professor of law with a background in biochemistry. So I come from a scientific background, but have done all of my sort of post-educational work in the field of law and ethics, and specialize in particular in looking at the legal, ethical, and social issues that arise from brain interventions, but also what we, regulation of neurotechnology, what kinds of insights we get about human behavior from neuroscience, so cognitive, behavioral neuroscience, affective neuroscience, and what kind of ramifications that should have back onto the law. So a sort of a bi-directional view of what does the law say about neurotechnology, but what does neurotechnology and neuroscience say about the law, and also moral psychology of human beings. So that's what I'm most interested in, and I teach mental health law and work in the area of the criminal intersection as well of the brain sciences. And I've sort of had board of directors
My ongoing work primarily is in the area of neurological mechanisms that are involved in affective disorders, cognition, emotions, and behaviors, and certainly how emerging and current trends in neuroscience and neurotechnology are able to assess the brain, access the brain, and affect the brain. Principal among these, of course, have been those emerging technologies that have provided state-of-the-art access and capability to record from the living brain, interpret what those signals are, and then also write into the living brain. Some of my ongoing work has been I've served as a senior bioethicist on the Neuroethical, Legal, and Social Issues Advisory Panel for the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency since 2013 as part of the BRAIN Initiative in the United States. I was a senior fellow and task leader for dual-use brain science for the European Union's Human Brain Project for a number of years. Served also with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development as the co-chair of their task force on emerging neuroscience and technology, and serve as chair emeritus of the IEEE Brain Initiative Neuroethics Project. And so it's a pleasure to be here. Ongoing work in the field certainly has had almost linear development over the past 5 to 10 years. And one of the things we're seeing ever more is that there is, in fact, an international focus and effort in the brain sciences. And although primarily enterprises of major developing countries in terms of transatlantic and trans-Pacific international collaborators, and in some cases competitors, also what we're seeing is it's changing some of the dynamic relationships that exist on multinational levels between those developed countries and various segues within their population, segments within those populations, as well as the relationships that exist between developed nations that have neuroscientific and technological capabilities, developing nations that are seeking to engage this forum and perhaps enter what is now being known as the neurobioeconomy, and non-developed nations, and what that then means for leverage, capability, and relative domains of hegemony, ethical, legally, and socially. Back over to you, Jen.
Okay, thanks very much, Jim. Maram, do you want to just introduce yourself? I don't know if everyone knows you or not, but would you mind just saying a word or two and also about the special issue? And then perhaps I will then give a bit of an overview of what we have planned for the rest of the session.
Yeah, my name is Maroon Bixson. I'm a professor of biomedical engineering at the City College of New York, and I'm also the technology and modeling editor for the Journal of Brain Stimulation. And so I think that Harold and Mark, who founded the journal, have built it up to the journal of record in brain stimulation. But where there is, I think, an opportunity for the journal to play a larger role in is in the discussions around what we're talking about today, which is sort of some of the ethical and legal aspects around brain stimulation. And just as an engineer, I think that embracing and understanding those issues will lead to the creation of better products. So I think this is really a very practical discussion of how we get things done. There is a special call for a special issue. That was really the brainchild of Professor Fectu, and then Dr. Chandler and Dr. Giordano are also the guest editors of that special issue. If you go to the Brain Stimulation website, you can find the information for that special call. And we highly encourage you, if you're interested, to submit, to reach out to us beforehand to get feedback, or if for no other reason that a limited number of submissions that are invited will have their submission fee waived. So if not for advice, for financial reasons, reach out to us first. But I think that commitment from Elsevier really represents how important this special issue is considered for future direction for the journal. So thanks.
Great, thank you, Maram. And so what we planned for today is we have a relatively big window of time, and we'll go along and see how it goes. Since it's a relatively small group, I think it would be great if we could make it sort of as interactive as possible. So I would suggest, if the others are okay with this, that if you have comments or questions, just flip on your camera, wave a hand, or put up a hand through Zoom function or whatever. So that way we don't have a sort of a lengthy talking head kind of thing, but instead get into a bit of an exchange, because it would be highly instructive for us to hear from you, your thoughts about all of this as well. So we had in mind two components to the discussion today. The first was going to be Jim and I giving a bit of a high level discussion of what are the main issues arising in neuroethics of neuromodulation. So if we were to ask the question, what would a neuroethics of neuromodulation be about? We're going to talk a little bit about what our thoughts are on that subject, staying at the level of relatively high level principles, but then being careful to actually drill it down to some concrete problems to bring it to life and not stay at too much in the abstract. So Jim will start out talking a bit about technologies. I'm going to come in with some high-level ethical implications and principles. Jim will talk about the international scene, and I will give you some concrete legal and regulatory problems after that. And we think this will take maybe a half hour, 45 minutes, but please do jump in with questions and comments as we go along. And the second main topic we wanted to cover with you today is building neuroethics for the brain stimulation journal community. So this is reflecting a little bit on the special issue, what sorts of topics you would see as essential to include. We're the editors and we'll be making decisions about its contents and managing peer review and everything. But hearing your reflections on that would be very helpful. But also trying to have a bit of a discussion about possible future initiatives for the journal. And we, Jim and I, brainstormed also with Maram and Shirley a few thoughts on what could be done on a continuing basis to try to develop community and develop the conversation and make this a bit of an ongoing as opposed to a one-off kind of discussion. So with that, I will pause just for a sec to see if anyone wants to add anything to the agenda. Okay. Well, we'll go ahead with that as planned. And so, Jim, can I turn that over to you to launch our discussion a bit of the technologies?
Sure, Jen. Thanks so very much. Yeah. I mean, in general, if we were to summarize those technologies that would fall under the broad rubric of brain stimulation, that would tend to include all those viable capabilities that directly interface with the brain. The question then becomes, are we also looking at those things that might be peripheral neural stimulators that are providing, if you will, stimulation to the brain downrange, by virtue of peripheral inputs, modulating the sensorium, the perception, and as a consequence, therefore having input capability to affect the brain? Offhand, I would say no, let's not do that, because what that does, at least initially, is it opens a little bit too much of a capture window. It also, I think, provides some interesting insights to some possibilities that are not yet fully formed and what those interfaces might be. But I think probably the most exciting areas are those that directly afford biotechnological interface with the brain parenchyma, with the brain substance, and therefore can be able to assess and affect what the brain does, which realistically, in terms of the encapsulation of those functions, thought, feelings, behaviors, and each and all of those occurring in an individual for whom the locus of that agency represents self. And therefore, realistically, what you're doing is you're modulating the brain to affect those functions that we refer to as mind. Even being able to assess mind, which I don't care how you shake that out, that's coming out to some form of mind reading, and or being able to affect those brain functions of thought, emotionality, and their outputs in the behavioral ecological domains, which is mind control. So as soon as those words sort of come out of your mouth, what tends to happen is there is that ethical, legal, and social resonance. What are you doing here and how are you doing it? Well, this too then harkens back onto one of the fundamental issues that you have to address. What are the actual capabilities of the technology and what technologies are able to engage those capabilities? In the main, we have two general categories, those technologies that are able to be donnable and doffable. In other words, the wearable applicable technologies, such as transcranial electrical stimulation, either with regard to the clinical capabilities and somewhat higher currents and frequencies that can be used in clinico, or those that are low output transcranial electrical stimulation that are characteristically reserved for direct-to-consumer applications, although here too we have a gray zone, and that there is a budding and building do-it-yourself market and community that's harnessing essentially both components. A component of low output that may allow for some accessibility of those market products that are available, either directly or indirectly, and then modifying those products in such ways as to be able to have clinical grade capability for transcranial brain modulation. We also have, for example, those forms of transcranial magnetic stimulation, either repeated TMS and your single-time TMS, and more what we're beginning to develop is closed-circuit TMS that is then utilizing some form of sensing device, whether it's an EEG or whether it's some form of situational sensing device that's then able to engage perhaps the ability to utilize a more donable and doffable form that can be administered and therefore utilized outside of the clinic and perhaps in paraclinical environments. Interestingly, the idea of utilizing brain stimulation in paraclinical environments opens up yet another milieu of possibility, of capability, of challenge, of opportunity, in some cases of things problematic. At what point do we then say that these types of technologies, particularly those that do not involve some form of medical or surgical gatekeeping for the actual instrumentation itself, become part of lifestyle, wellness? And even if we pull back from that a bit, there's the idea of what constitutes occupational preventive medicine. In other words, could we utilize these techniques in those ways, left of bang, to keep individuals off of some slope, slippery or otherwise, of denigration into loss of resilience, loss of resistance, and or increased capitalization of those skills of thought, emotion, and behavior that we constitute as being good neurocognitive and good neuropsychiatric health? Well, the accessibility of these donable and doffable techniques makes them relatively easy, not only to acquire, but also to use in both of those clinical and paraclinical, as well as non-clinical settings. But one of the problems with those technologies is that they tend to lack some forms of specificity. I mean, we understand that the transcranial nature of either electrical or magnetic delivery certainly is able to affect the cortical mantle, and in that way, perhaps back propagate and forward propagate particular conductivities and modulate those effects in those nodes and networks that have cortical connectivity, cortical connections, and cortical throughputs. So what you're really doing is creating a ripple in the cortical mantle, so to speak, directly. And you're sort of hoping for the best to be able to get those effects in subcortical structures that may be affected either indirectly or directly by the manipulation of those various threshold capabilities and functional parameters of the cortex and initial subcortical levels. So what you're really doing there is, again, you're creating a ripple effect. You're creating something of a downstream, downrange effect. And in many ways, this has been one of the criticisms of those types of technologies, and that we really don't understand completely what it is that they do. And if we do come to that point where understanding meets current capability, do we then have the tools to be able to make it do what we want it to do better? In other words, are we able to deepen and or specify with greater precision the relative capability to access and therefore affect not only those most superficial cortical levels with our understanding of how those cortical levels may be involved in various functions, but increase the precision, increase the gain and the granularity of affecting deeper subcortical structures in a precise, organized, and in that way, technospecific way? The answer to some of those questions is yes, we are. And one of the ways of doing that is, of course, to essentially go deep. Not just to utilize those transcranial methods, but to actually go deeper into the brain parenchyma, to be able to access those deeper brain tissues. This is not new. This is the idea of deep brain stimulation. But what is new are the threefold dynamics that have really increased the complexity and therefore overall specificity, capability, and, if you will, precision of what deep brain stimulation is essentially acquiring, number one, and achieving, number two. And those three factors are the ability to map the brain more specifically utilizing heterogeneous but co-registered techniques, imaging, electrophysiology, biophysical modeling, connectomics, and then putting those into a register of structural functional maps that therefore allow us to say these are the viable sites that are involved in doing X, Y, or Z. And as a consequence, these also become capable targets. Number two is an increase in the sophistication and capability of the actual, quote, hardware itself of the brain stimulating electrodes, multipolar electrodes that have heterogeneous capabilized fields that can then penetrate at a variety of depths and that are not unipolar, but essentially are able to create multiple fields at different loci at different depths in and around the identified and selective neurological target. What this is allowing you to do is to really in relatively real time. And that real time factor is, in fact, the third dimension. What we're able to do now is to have open loop, semi-open loop, and closed loop systems that allow for feed forward and feedback modulation, both within the brain and ecologically within the embodied individual, getting feedback from that individual's bodily responses, as well as perhaps more broadly ecological, environmental, circumstantial awareness, sensitivity, and inputs that then differentially engage these brain stimulating units to be able to have much more precision as to when the device is on, when the device is off, how the device is modulating particular nodes, networks, and circuits, and then the storage and integration of those data to be able to create defined patterns that can be used casuistically, not only in that particular patient, but for others in the future. The next step, however, in the technology really brings us into the essential brave new world, or at very, very least, bold new neurotechnology. The question is, will we, the developers and users, be brave enough to understand not only what those capabilities confer, but also what those capabilities may infer to the need for various civic institutions and ethical, legal, and social structures that are able to address and in some cases guide and govern the way these very cutting edge technologies could be used and should be used, or perhaps should not be used. And here what we're talking about are those forms of brain stimulation that are minimally or non-invasive, the essential next generation non-invasive neuromodulation projects. Perhaps prototypic among them is the N-Cubed project, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency at DARPA, but it's not a standalone project. It's prototypic and exemplary of other types of projects that exist not only in the United States, but perhaps worldwide as well. We know of similar projects, for example, that are underway in China, India, and the idea of the actual capability to develop nanoscalar sensors and transmitters that can be non-invasively introduced to the brain parenchyma to form a vast array of sensing and transmitting electrodes to be able to read from the living brain and write into the living brain remotely represents both state of the science and state of the technological art. And as such, represents, if you will, the bleeding cutting edge of where the field can go. Being able to introduce technology to the brain in those ways with minimal invasiveness, yet with high specificity, high remote access, and therefore incredible capability to be able to essentially scan the brain and read, literally read what it is doing. And also to be able to take what is being read, translate that into various forms of meaning in a number of different domains, what the thought means for emotion and what that may mean both descriptively and predictively for behavior, and then to target those brain regions that are being able to be accessed so as to affect those outputs of thought, feeling, and action, once again, remotely on a variety of scales and levels. That opens a Pandora's jar, not only in terms of the capability of the science and technology, but the capability of those of us who develop and utilize the science and technology in and across a variety of different applications, dimensions and domains in medicine, daily life, and even those things that can affect global biosecurity, public health, and public safety. Jen, back over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Jim. So what I'd like to do now is say a couple of words under, I guess, about 8 separate headings about some of the main themes in the neuroethics of neuromodulation that are discussed. And I would start with a kind of a meta level cross-cutting observation that because of the heterogeneity of the space, shall we say it's multidimensional, there's a range of different types of neuromodulation technologies with different characteristics and capabilities. There's a range of different, shall we say, target indications, both populations and objectives of the stimulation, therapeutic and non-therapeutic, shall we say, wellness, enhancement, other potential applications that are not properly understood as falling within medicine. And sort of the intersection of all of these creates little pockets of application of technology, each of which might affect the balance of the various ethical and legal principles that apply. So it's complex. And so what I will say is under sort of 8 main themes, the way the trade-off or the particular issues end up cashing out will vary by which particular technology and application we're discussing. And a second preface remark I'd make too is that ethics, I think often when we think of ethics, we think of, actually lawyers are even worse, we think of someone showing up and saying all the things one should not do and all the risks and so forth. There's the important sort of ethical other side to this, which is the opportunities foregone for therapeutic benefit as well, which has to be kept in mind in weighing risks and benefits. And the other thing is ethics often identifies a range of desired properties or outcomes, many of which are in conflict. The pursuit of one will mean having to compromise on another. So it's often a matter of a kind of a complex discussion and balancing to try to identify what is optimal, and then what is optimal ends up, hopefully, or should I say, ends up being refracted often suboptimally through the political and legal process. So when we're talking about trying to handle the normative or like values-based assessment of technologies like that, it can get pretty complicated pretty quickly. But this isn't to say we shouldn't do it, and it isn't to say that it's extremely important and extremely interesting, because there's a certain path dependence in the choices of research questions to ask, the choices of technology to develop that mean that certain kinds of questions are going to come up later on, and therefore there's an opportunity early on to anticipate and address some of the potential future problems early on in the stage of development of these technologies. So much for prefatory remarks. So one of the themes that came up in the neuroethics discussion around brain stimulation of the invasive and non-invasive types early on in the neuroethics discussion was a debate over this sort of neuroenhancement. So there was this big discussion about cognitive enhancement, and this got at this question of distinguishing between what is therapeutic, which most people would have thought was largely uncontroversial, and yet what is enhancement, where people seek to go beyond what is therapeutic. And the particular sort of nugget of the controversy there had to do with whether people were choosing enhancement autonomously, or instead were being pressed quasi-coercively by a competitive society, by employers, by insurers to try to enhance, and whether this was an autonomous thing. Arrayed against that was the observation that if you try to stop people from doing this, you are in some ways restricting their freedom to enhance if they feel like it. So there was a tension in there. There's also a tension about whether access to enhancing forms of neuromodulation might widen the gap between the haves and have-nots. So an access question. If we found something that was very effective, for example, to support children's education, would it be only those relatively advantaged who would zoom ahead, leaving others behind? So these were some of the kinds of themes that came up in the enhancement discussion. Another key discussion that came up early and has been continuing, and this builds on what Jim was saying, is when we start to do things that modify mental states and behavior, a certain amount of concern arose about this so-called PIAS. PIAS is an acronym standing for personality, identity, agency, authenticity, autonomy, and self, PAAS. And these are all ways somewhat vaguely at getting at a cluster of concerns about what about the self, the nature of the self, and the stability of the self. So this can get very philosophical fairly quickly, and it's proven to be an exceedingly difficult thing to try to research in the context of neuromodulation. It's hard to create kind of validated scales to assess these kinds of changes in still relatively small populations. It's also unclear whether the kinds of changes observed, an anecdotal report that someone feels a little bit like a puppet, for example, is that itself due to the stimulation, due to the psychological understanding that a patient has of the stimulation? Are some of the changes in behavior or personality more a reflection of the removal of, for example, Parkinsonian symptoms and a shift in relationships between the patient and family and caregivers? So there's all these uncertainties about whether the stimulation itself lies at the heart of these shifts in personality, or instead are just reflecting, for example, the removal of the pathological symptoms results in changes to a person's behavior and self-image and personal relationships. So this is tricky to untangle, but I think it's quite critical, especially as we move into closed loop or closed circuit or adaptive forms of brain stimulation, where the kinds of shifts that might be associated with the stimulation are occurring in real time in ways that are potentially opaque to the patient as well as the clinician, and trying to figure out what to do about that kind of thing. Is that something to be concerned about? Are we certain that patients themselves will be able to detect these changes? And what if they are changes, as we sometimes see in the treatment of Parkinson's or OCD with brain stimulation, of hypomanic behavior and maybe sometimes manic behavior that can cause substantial harm to finances and personal relationships and job relationships? So in a way, none of this is new. We have been manipulating our brain function for thousands of years with various substances and more recently with various pharmacological agents. But is there something different here, especially with adaptive brain stimulation, where some of the when it's on, when it's off, when the stimulation parameters are on is less is opaque? Collected sort of under this kind of heading of concern about personal identity and agency are concerns also about the types of unintended effects of stimulation, because if adaptive systems are designed to target a particular pathological characteristic and maybe anticipate one or two particular side effects, it means they're not optimizing for potential other side effects, the unknown unknowns, as it were. And so are we relying on the patient and intermittently a clinician to be able to detect those and address those? Other concerns, if we were to start to influence the reward circuitry of the brain, is there going to be concern about sort of addictive behaviors or compulsive behaviors if people start to have reward circuitry activated by some of the stimulation? And here we get into a second order tricky question about autonomy and control. In those circumstances, how much control should be left to the patient in terms of whether stimulation's on or not, when hedonic circuitry might be being activated by the stimulation? So a whole cluster of issues arising around this personality, identity, agency, authenticity, and how to balance the potential risks of a shift of personality against allowing the person, after all, to decide for themselves on an ongoing basis whether, in fact, a new state is properly to be viewed as their new authentic self. So these are tricky ethical and philosophical questions, but I think also raise some really interesting problems for clinicians about how to handle these. So so much for enhancement and for PS changes. Another really big issue in this space is this question of data privacy and security. So evidently, as we start to do neuromodulation, and again, especially the adaptive, and are gathering data from the brain or from other biomarkers, there's going to be a host of relatively sensitive information, let me just say potentially sensitive information being collected. And early on, there was a lot of pushback against ethicists saying, oh, you guys think we're going to read minds. Nobody can read minds. None of this can read minds. I think perhaps this is true. Like one can never know exactly the contents of someone's conscious thoughts. However, the more and more data we get, the more and more tempted we are to make inferences from that data about mental states. And in fact, that's the whole underlying logic of closed loop or adaptive brain stimulation, which is to detect particular mental states or onsets of movements or things like that from biomarkers, make an inference from the data about those mental states, whether it's mood or impulsivity or attention or whatever, and then to respond to that. So the whole logic relies upon a certain form of mind reading, shall we say, inference about mental states and behaviors from neural and other biomarker data. So if we get better at this, there will be this kind of form of mind reading enabled by this kind of technology. And so that raises all sorts of questions for us about what to do with that data. Evidently, the gathering, the collecting, the sharing of this data would be an unbelievable boon to research for improvement of the neurotechnology, to improve clinical outcomes, to develop treatments, especially when with the invasive technologies, we still have relatively small numbers. There's almost an ethical imperative to gather all the data so that it can be used for its greatest benefit. How do we deal with the privacy of people and also their rights, perhaps, to have control over what is potentially quite personal information? Second question, who should have a secondary access and for what potential usages? So there is a case in Ohio in the last few years of a man with a pacemaker having his pacemaker data subpoenaed in a prosecution for arson. He was accused of burning down his house. He said he was doing something at the time. His pacemaker data said unlikely, and this was accepted in a court. And obviously a secondary use of biomedical data gathered from an implantable medical device. What sorts of information could one infer from with regard to mental activities? Would be interesting, for example, to know in a dangerous driving context if someone was paying attention. Were they asleep? These kinds of things would be quite relevant for prosecutions for dangerous driving and criminal negligence. So we have to think about what should be collected. There's good uses, there's secondary uses. Often the impulse in these situations is to say, ooh, if there's a potential bad use of the technology, we will just make sure we never collect anything. I personally, speaking personally, think that that's too quick, that's sometimes the right impulse, but perhaps too quick, especially if some of this data might be useful for research and therapy. But sometimes one can answer these kinds of concerns by controlling the downstream use, by saying we cannot use this data for certain purposes, for example, in court. And this is the approach taken in the United States with the genetic, what's the word for it, Insurance Non-Discrimination Act, GINA, which is, yes, we collect the information, but we can't use it for certain purposes. Is another way to deal with concerns. Another issue under the heading of privacy and security of data is, what do we do about the fact that it's not so much researchers and clinicians, perhaps, that might generate the vast bulk of this information. It may be private entities, whether it's the Neuralinks or the Facebooks, who are going to be really bringing these kinds of...
Sorry.
Bringing these technologies... thanks, Jim. Bringing these technologies to the retail level, shall we say, and really in a position to build up large amounts of data. If these are in the hands of private corporations, which will have all possible incentive to hang on to it, it's valuable information, is this a problem as well? So at the regulatory level, we have to be thinking about where this data is going to accumulate and what that means for the development of the field. A couple of other, just keeping an eye on the time here, a couple of other key issues that are raised would come under the heading, and this is largely the sort of a research ethics or an early stage as opposed to translational kind of ethics issues, but a couple of issues surrounding what to do about people enrolled in clinical trials of devices. Is there, and this is to my knowledge not yet resolved, but continues to be being discussed, what do we do for people who are enrolled, for example, for an invasive device, an implantable device, and find it beneficial, but who come to the end of the clinical trial and basically that's the end? Is there an obligation to provide some sort of ongoing access for those who have benefited, having already put themselves at some risk for the benefit of the research? Typically, there's no obligation currently to provide the continued care. There's in some cases no obligation to pay for the explantation of a device. And you have to rely on your own health insurance to have that done, which may be forthcoming or not. So there's this continued access to care and the devices. And there's this issue about the device removal. And so let me segue out of the research context also, because this is sort of a little bit related. Some of you may have seen in the last couple of months in the press a discussion of this kind of orphan population of patients who have neuroprostheses, and what happens to them when the commercial enterprise that makes the device goes bankrupt. So this happened recently with Second Sight, which didn't quite go bankrupt, but has been, as far as I read in the news, has been merged with another entity which has a different focus. but it leaves a variety of people out there with retinal prostheses implanted for which they can't get ongoing maintenance and upgrading, nor can they get advice about whether these devices are inconsistent with magnetic resonance imaging. So here's another question, which brings us to the whole issue of, shall we say, the life cycle regulation of an implantable neuroprosthesis. The issues are less acute, obviously, for wearables, but I think some of them are partly analogous. This issue of continued support and access. Is there an obligation to provide it to those who have participated in research? So DIY neurostimulation, Jim mentioned this. This is has been going on for some time. When I'm told, I haven't looked in a little while, but one can find YouTube videos about how to get a bunch of batteries and some electrodes and rig it up. This, I think, raises some tricky questions, because typically this is not a regulated field. It'd be very difficult to regulate something like this. These are sort of average people who are generally left to do what they want. It becomes perhaps more of a legal issue if, for example, somebody decided to apply it to their child or to their an incapable dependent, where we might start to ask questions about whether there's legal issues about endangering the safety of a child or dependent. I'm not aware of a big legal discussion of that for now. It may be that these DIY devices haven't yet produced damage that has come to the public knowledge, but that's certainly a tricky area of what to do. And it links into another issue that's discussed in the literature, which is the concern about media coverage and hype of neuromodulation technologies. And that is that, broadly speaking, there's a risk of hype, risk of selective reporting from the scientific researcher level because of small samples and a reluctance to report negative results. There's the media imperative to sell newspapers and attract advertising, which is to talk up the capacities of these technologies. And all of this together, it said, creates unrealistic expectations in the public. And this itself feeds back perhaps to the DIY type of behavior that we can see in some quarters. So the issue, coming back to the ethics, is what might be the responsibilities, if any, of the scientific community to be speaking on the capacities of this technology and to be trying to do a bit of scientific communication to the public about all this. There's a host of, to me, really interesting questions about consent to neuromodulation therapies. I've recently done a big study of international laws relating to psychosurgery or neurosurgery for psychiatric conditions. So this would apply often to deep brain stimulation and other implanted forms of brain and peripheral stimulation, vagus nerve stimulation, et cetera. Some of these laws actually refer to non-invasive neurostimulation. So I'm going to make a mistake right now. I'm thinking back to the paper. I think it might be Scotland, but this is a more modern piece of legislation that attempts to target all neuromodulation, including non-invasive. So I think this is something that the field should keep an eye on and, contribute to the formation of an optimal regulatory legal regime for the application of these technologies. Typically, these laws contain rules around eligibility and consent. So some might rule out application of these technologies to incapable people. So they might say only those who can give first-person capable consent can receive these technologies. Now, this kind of cautious approach emanates from the mid-20th century experience and backlash against the lobotomy, but quite obviously we've moved well beyond that. But it does have that kind of flavor of from the 1960s to 80s sort of anti-psychiatry, anti-ECT, anti-brain interventions for psychiatric purposes. But it creates a conservative and restrictive access in some places. And since it appears, I read, these small n studies suggesting that neurostimulation can be beneficial for populations who really have it very tough. I'm thinking of people with autoaggression and intellectual disability, where management of behavior does not leave much room for quality of life and freedom and so forth. There's a trade-off to protecting people from interventions, neuromodulatory interventions that we feel might be exploitative or dangerous or whatnot, versus leaving them, the nuclear option of protection so much that they can't have access to something that might be superior to their current options. So I think these are the kinds of issues around like the extreme consent and capacity issues. Short of that, there's all the clinical ethical obligations to manage for patients who might be operating under therapeutic deception, who might be feeling obliged to consent to treatments proposed by clinician researchers. These are familiar kinds of issues, but they do arise here as well and need to be considered. And I think, let's see, if I've got one or two more comments to make, and then, yeah, I think why don't I stop there? And maybe ask to see if there's any questions. I think that I would turn it over to Jim also to talk a little bit about the international scene. I was going to, just before he launch into that, say that I came across a systematic review of clinicaltrials.gov published in 2021 in this very journal, Elias and colleagues, who looked at neuromodulation clinical trials ongoing at the time in 2021. Finding that of 37 countries, the biggest were the US and China, most for depression, 45%, schizophrenia, 18%, and substance use disorder, 14%. US representing 28% and China 13% as the most active areas. So thinking internationally, what does this mean if most of the work is coming out of those two countries? I find it interesting as a lawyer also that so much attention is directed to substance use disorders. This is a very serious area of disability, but it's also a highly criminalized area of disability. So one can imagine rehabilitation of those convicted of crimes. Technologies like this slipping into these quasi-therapeutic domains where we walk some very tight lines in terms of the voluntariness of consent, and especially when this is being done in countries perhaps where there's relatively less concern for individual autonomy, both generally, but in the criminal justice context, it's a reason for attention. So let me turn it over to Jim again to talk a bit about the international scene.
Thanks so much, Jen. I mean, a lot of the points that you made are really reflective of the fact that these technologies do exist. And these technologies are existing in a multinational, multicultural 21st century global environment. I mean, if we just think about that for a moment and we look at who those share and stakeholders are who are making major investments in interventional neurotechnologies, such as various forms of brain stimulation, you're absolutely right. We see the two major share and stakeholders of investments within the neurobioeconomy, being the United States and many of the United States' international collaborative economic allies, and China. The question then becomes as to whether or not the products that are developed, that are studied, and that are articulated within various markets remain the sole domain of those groups, those cultures, those nations that develop it. Or in fact, there develops an interchange market, an exchangeable market. And what does that then mean for, on one level, actual issues focal to the technology, such things as interoperability, capability and support of use, longitudinality of use, viability of access to serial iterations of technology, version 1, 2, 3, etc. But then also those somewhat more derivative issues, as you had alluded to earlier. What does that mean then for the individuals who could get these technologies, who are getting these technologies, and perhaps who should or should not get these technologies, which then reflects back upon, if you will, the heterogeneity of key aspects of the global market and the global developmental and articulation use space. If we just consider this for a moment, realistically, we have to appreciate the fact, be responsive and sensitive to, that these brain stimulation technologies are primarily, once again, being developed by the United States and its international allies in China. Now, if we just consider that for a moment, one of the conversations that was literally broached in some of the meetings of the Organization for International Cooperation and Development, focal to these types of technologies, was the fact that these nations do not necessarily share common histories. And given the absence of common history, or the interaction of histories that are perhaps differently perspectival, inclusive in some case, those that are in tension, or perhaps even some form of conflict, social conflict, economic conflict, what you then have is a relative apposition of longstanding cultural norms, values, needs. And as a consequence of that, what you then begin to see is divergence in simple aspects of culture, literally what people view to be important, what they require environmentally, ecologically, as a consequence of their geopolitics, or perhaps as the architectonics and epidemiology of their populations. Who has an older population, who has a younger population, who has certain restrictions of population in terms of what populations actually are constituted with regard to relative balance of age, distribution, and even founder and penetrance effects of various genotypes and phenotypes. But more than that, which you must understand, is that those cultures and histories intersect and interact to be able to provide not only the values of those individuals who comprise the polis, but the philosophies that codify those values, identify those needs, and begin to articulate how those needs can then become viable in real world articulations and practices. And this is where we have ethics. So here, ethics differ. In some cases, those ethics differ as a consequence of profoundly distinct aspects of a culture, religion, orientation of social norms, politics, economics. And in other cases, they're intersecting. The question then becomes, what do we do about those areas of intersection? What do we do about those areas of dissensus? And how do we create some consensus in moving forward? This then would demand at least some appreciation for a cosmopolitan view of how these neurotechnologies are being studied, developed, and put into various practices in medicine and elsewhere. But in that cosmopolitan view, also some appreciation for the distinctions that exist within and between various communities. A collectivist society, for example, might view participation of individuals in research and the relative distribution of goods, resources, and services quite differently from more of an inclusive population, an inclusive society. And while it may be that when in Rome, one might do as the Romans do, and perhaps even should, the problem is that science and technology itself has created a relative ubiquity of international capabilities. We can Zoom, we can meet, we can discuss real time with our international colleagues and our competitors. As you had alluded to earlier, Jen, the access to data, as well as the generation, storage, provenance, and custodianship of data is becoming ever more a multinational enterprise. And as exists right now, there really are not governances and guidance mechanisms, treaties and conventions that are able to oversee, surveil, and to some cases, restrict, and in other cases, be more permissive as to how neurodata can and perhaps should be used. This original point was brought up almost 10 years ago by the attorney Stephanie Kostyuk, calling for something akin to GINA that she referred to as NINA, a Neurological Information Non-Discrimination Act. And we've supported that over the past decade ardently, because so much of what neuroscience and technology can do, particularly those forms of brain stimulation that are reliant upon sensing the living brain, gaining information from the living brain, creating patterns from that information, then using those data in those ways that are both definitive as well as in some cases speculatively predictive, requires the probity of how those data are stored and used, who has access, and what that means for both idiosyncratic capability, benefit, burden, and risk, as well as systemic benefit, burden, and risk. But realistically, even in those circumstances, we have to be appreciative of the fact that there are not only similarities, but distinctions on how various groups, cultures, nations, politics will view what constitutes benefit. Who's good? What rationale? What justice, to paraphrase the words of moral philosopher Alistair McIntyre at the University of Notre Dame. What may be good for us, whoever the proverbial us may be, might be very, very different in terms of definitive goods for others, and vice versa. Even things as fundamental as what one might consider to be human rights may change relatively
based upon a collectivist orientation to what rights are preserved when individuals, if you will, vary, or in some cases transcend norms, laws that are essential to the community, versus those more open, liberal situations in politics that preserve human rights in and across a variety of groups, inclusive of those vulnerabilized by incarceration. The other issue then becomes what happens if things that are advanced in one place are not necessarily advanced in another? Are we then opening the door, for example, for research tourism? And if in fact there is that research tourism, is that a form of ethics dumping, or is that really just an appreciation of ethical heterogeneity that therefore allows the proverbial technological imperative to be realized in and across a variety of fronts in very real world practices? But what happens in Rome stays in Rome. What happens in Sparta stays in Sparta? Certainly not. Because if the outcomes, deliverables, products, and services, the capabilities of the science and technology are realized in one place, it enters into the global neurobioeconomic market. And then here, the question is one of demand. What then happens if these developments, if these technologies and their capabilities are available, but not only are available, are made viable, provisionable, fieldable, accessible? This then opens the door for medical tourism, which then obviously opens yet another Pandora's jar of what happens in place X, if that is indeed, as you mentioned before, supportable in place Y or Z. Is there continuity of research? Is there continuity of technological development? Is there continuity of clinical care to be able to meet these issues of interoperability, exchange, relative obsolescence of various techniques and technologies? And what that then means for those individuals who are not only stakeholders in the technologies, but those user groups, some of whom may be patients, some of whom may not be, maybe those individuals who are working left of proverbial bang for forms of optimization, performance capitalization, enhancement, if you will. But what happens when version 2.0 and 3.0 comes out, and then you're not able to get that? Or in the very real sense, for example, second eye, if you see issues where a particular company is folded, absorbed, goes bankrupt, and therefore the resources and services may not be available in perpetuity. Do these individuals fall between the cracks? And then what happens to the neurologically and neurotechnologically capabilized haves and the have-nots? What it speaks to is the fact that neuroscience and neurotechnology of brain stimulation is indeed becoming a multinational, multicultural market space. It's not all inclusive, and in some cases there are exclusions, and we need to understand what those exclusions infer for individuals, for groups, and collectives, and how those inclusions and exclusions may also be influential to create influences, leverages, and hegemonies of the sort that the French existential philosopher Michel Foucault referred to as biopower and biopolitics. We have to ask the proverbial long-standing question, cui bono? Who will benefit? Cui malo? Who will be harmed? Or at very, very least, who will be burdened? And how will we accommodate that? It requires not only a discourse, I think, but really a dialectic. I mean, a true dialectic, one that seeks to engage theses and, if you will, antitheses, or at very, very least counter theses, looking at various perspectives and standpoints that may be intrinsic in one place, but foreign in others, to try to come to points of consensus, inclusive of points of where we should have dissensus, in ways that are cooperative and in ways that are competitive. The new field of coopetition, for example, looms large on the horizon of the 21st century international stage. And from that, I think that creates something that's far more both synthetic, bringing these theses together, but also syncretic. Various views, perspectives, values, and visions, and beliefs, if you will, about the relative benefit, burdens, risks, and potential harms of this neurotechnology as they evolve in the real world, and what we may need to do as civic institutions, both locally as well as multinationally and collectively, so as to be able to not only remain effective, but to remain safe and to define what safety means in and across a variety of scales. Jen, back over to you.
Thanks so much, Jim. And I will just add that when doing my research into laws of neuropsychosurgery around the world, it was really interesting to see, in fact, the amount of medical tourism. Well, it's not a huge amount, obviously, for ablative psychosurgery, but there is reports from certain Australian states observing that patients were traveling across state lines given the prohibition on ablative psychosurgery in one state. And also one can see movement of patients from Australia, the same locations, into India to get ablative psychosurgery. So what might seem improbable, that someone would travel for these kinds of brain interventions, in fact, it has already been happening. So this question of how to address medical tourism, how to ensure safety, continuity of care, recourse if there's problems, who takes in hand a patient who has received deep brain stimulation in one country and requires ongoing psychiatric and neurological care. So all of these issues will have to be sorted out. And I was going to just take a moment to put one additional ethical issue on the table, which I think would be of particular interest and relevance to this community that we haven't come across in discussion yet. Another key issue that has been getting some attention, not enough attention in my view, and this is another legal topic, is the question of the patenting of various neuromodulation protocols. So we need to go into intellectual property law and figure out what are the limits, how do the principles of patent law apply to discoveries of technologies, indications, target locations, methods, protocols. We're going to have to sort of sort out what are the pros and cons of patenting as a form of exclusionary property right, how that works in this particular field. Given that there's going to be probably one given brain target is likely to be potentially relevant for a host of different types of applications. So we have to kind of keep an eye on what's happening there, lest some form of patent thicket or form of patenting practice develop that impedes the development of the space. So I think we really need a little more attention to that issue as well. So I think with that, we're at 3:10. What I might suggest is we close the discussion from Jim and I on various neuroethical issues and just ask you if you have any questions or observations before turning to our second topic.
Jennifer, I just found the way you guys discussed these international dimensions so interesting. I mean, I know in the US, we regulate ourselves, right? We have our ethical reviews before anything goes away. And recently, I've been serving on NIH study sections, and every neurotech grant has a separate ethicist on it. Like NIH is, at least in some areas, done giving out funds without having a not just ethical review, but having a dedicated person looking at the ethics. And you and Jim talked about the disparities. You mentioned how China is, in some cases second to the US now in certain metrics. And I'm just saying from the perspective of brain stimulation, I think those metrics are in some ways lagging. I mean, China is catching up. I can also say that they have access to they have a lot of resources to access very advanced equipment. They are not lacking in that regard, you know what I mean, as far as what they have. But they are subject to their own, when they're running these trials, they have, we don't see that work until it arrives at brain stimulation. And we are accepting it perhaps with the stamp, their stamp, you know what I mean, which may be fine, but it may be like, it's a different stamp than our stamp. And one more example would be Brazil, which has played an outsized role in neuromodulation when it comes to low cost technology. And you can argue there's various reasons for that. But certainly a sponsor may be aware that a trial in Brazil could cost, literally 500 times less than a trial in the US. And, there's various reasons for that, right? And so, but yet there's great work coming from Brazil. And so, and that work shows up at brain, among other journals, it shows up at brain stimulation. And anyway, so I know it was very interesting to me that this is a very, this is a current issue that we need to think about.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's tricky, and especially if there's more restrictive conditions for research in one jurisdiction versus another, you get a kind of a difficult race to the bottom kind of incentive pressure, I think, that develops. And what does one do about that?
Let's go one step further. Just kind of let me play devil's advocate, although I'm certainly not the lawyer here, the dreaded lawyer. But let me throw something out there that teeters on that ethical legal interface, but also really conjoins the commercial space. And by conjoining the commercial space, in what it's doing, the commercial space may also put up certain blankets, may throw certain shutters on the window that then create barriers to transparency, and as a consequence, create subsequent problems down the line. And here's the issue. So let's just say that we develop something somewhere. We'll call it country X. And it represents an innovative capabilization in interventional neurotechnology. And part of the reason for it is they've gone beyond the usual set of parameters for human testing because, let's just say, the overall ambiance of how human testing is done in country X is somewhat different than it is in country Y, Z, or A, B, and C. In other words, it may very well be that what we, whoever we may be, consider to be vulnerabilized populations who should be treated in particular ways, are actually regarded somewhat differently, where there may be some social norm or even sociocultural obligation for those individuals who may have transcended social or legal norms to pay it forward and therefore contribute to research. And as a consequence of that, certain parameters of either animal research and its translation to early stage human work and or direct advancement through various forms of human research could in fact be advanced so that we then get a deliverable, a product. And we'll call this product something. We'll call it some kind of neurofantastic product. And that neurofantastic product is of considerable value worldwide because there's a lot of things we can do with it. We could intervene early, or like voting in Chicago, we could intervene early and often. We could intervene later, and in intervening later, we may be able to have some sustainability of quality of life. Here again, think directly of something like DBS. Where in the clinical algorithm do we use it? Early, late, who gets it? But then, of course, we recognize that it was developed in country X, and the ethics of that research and perhaps even early stage clinical translation are not necessarily consistent with they might be in country Y, Z, or A, B, and C. Do we then use that thing? Or do we seek to in some way reverse engineer it? But should we? In other words, what is the nature of the viability of use if in fact the end product delivers some notable, recognizable consensus good, but the means did not necessarily pass muster, if you will, by each and all the ethical, legal, and social, quote, safeguards, or at very, very least norms, mores, and standards that would then allow a general amenability to, yeah, this represents good research. Yet the science is good. So you see, what tends to happen is you then develop these sort of downstream effects as to, well, what do we do? Do we use the good outcomes of what we consider to be unethical or dubiously ethical or improbitious research, even though the ends don't necessarily reflect the good of the means, but then whose goods? And if in fact those ends are ends that have a significant impact upon global quality of life, public health, individual safety, survivability, flourishing, do we look the other way? Or if in fact those ends are then uptaken into a commercial enterprise that are then veiled by certain commercial intellectual property veiling, does it then create yet another asymmetry in global balances of capability and power, which might then yield some issues of distributional inequities? So again, each and all of these issues that Maram has just brought up are very, very real. They're not hypothetical issues that exist within the realm of the philosophy of law or ethics, but rather really represent what's happening on the cutting edge of the science and technology, not only in research centers of academic and scholarly value and import, but also the relative translation and interoperability and cooperation between the commercial enterprise and research enterprises that can exist in very, very different structural and functional iterations outside of those key countries of development. For example, the United States and many of our, at least Western European and perhaps Trans-Pacific allies and cooperators. Different cultures have different orientations whereby the relative triple helix of government, the research enterprise, and the commercial enterprises are seamless. And within that seamlessness, create a whole set of infrastructures and functions that can be problematic to multinational, multicultural, global articulation and use when it comes to these types of developments and what goods and perhaps what burdens and even potential threats and harms they might yield. Back over to you.
Yeah, as you were speaking, I was thinking of the whole range of possible responses that are, to the problem that Maram identifies. This is sort of a variation in the ethical position between jurisdictions. And I'm thinking about my own country, Canada, which regards it as highly unethical to pay for blood donations, but merely imports plasma from the United States because we don't have enough plasma. Therefore, we basically just import it from where you can pay for it, right? So this kind of, shall we say, hypocritical response is one can take. Other responses, we can look at how the world has dealt, for example, with organ tourism, payment for transplantable organs, which there's been an attempt to have international treaties to prevent this, and discussion about whether a country should prosecute those returning from having purchased an organ abroad. This would be an extraterritorial expansion of criminal law. So there's a whole range of different things that could be done. And even if we stay outside the law, there are precedents for the research community itself using the tools it has to enforce jointly chosen ethical norms. Journals, for example, can refuse to publish certain kinds of research that transgresses certain principles. And we can look at how the world has dealt with human cloning, for example, as a sort of an instance of the need for some form of coherence or some perceived need for coherence across the world because it was sufficiently important. I don't know if we have specific no-go zones in neurotechnology on which we would all, the world would agree. Part of the difficulty, I think, is a lot of these neurotechnologies are, shall we say, dual use. What makes them useful for therapeutic use makes them useful for dodgy, unethical uses that we would deprecate and not want to see done. So it becomes difficult to try to prevent the development. Yeah, go ahead.
Let me intervene if I may, because here too, there's something of a proverbial Aslan gray zone. These are fuzzy boundaries. Let me explain. Realistically, even if we're utilizing neuroscience and technology of these sorts for ways that might optimize the occupational performance of those individuals whose occupation happen to be bellicose, well, then here too, I think the question is, well, then for what ends? Now, again, in full transparency, as you may know, much of my work has been supported by NATO, has been supported by the United States Department of Defense, the intelligence community, and our international allies, military allies, intelligence allies, to be able to utilize the brain sciences in those ways that are contra bellum, in other words, to prevent the escalation of aggression and violence to ultimately warfare in those ways that may create some amenability, for example, in narratives, understandings, etc., and how we get along well with others. But let's not kid ourselves for a moment. I mean, the reality of it is that no group of individuals, no collective goes off to war thinking that they are the proverbial bad guys. Everyone goes off to some level of conflict and engagement to do one of three things: to defend kin, kith, ideology, and way of life against perceived threats. Number two, to change, mitigate, in some cases eradicate or prevent those threats from growing, spreading, and therefore representing something downstream, or to at least remain abreast, remain apace of those developments that at some point or another are seen to cross some threshold, and therefore what you then see is some level of brinksmanship and escalation. And if the parameters of restrictions of such brinksmanship and escalation are in some way transgressed, well, there you go, you've crossed the magic threshold. So even here, I think it becomes important to take that discussion of dual use into what goods we're defining, what can be done, what should be done, and can we, whoever we may be, actually do what we should with regard to oversight, surveillance, regulation, guidance, and governance. And when we're discussing things such as militaries and intelligence uses of these technologies, much of those discourses occur in ways that are less than fully transparent because they have implications for national security, national biosecurity, and national defense, irrespective of whatever nation that may be. So the idea there is, do we crack the game book on Friday and still expect to, quote, win, whatever that may mean, come game time on Saturday? And very often the answer is no. So what does that then do to the nature of discourse and dialectic when in fact many of these neurotechnologies are not explicitly covered categorically or by virtue of some other criteria when it comes to the extant international laws and treaties and convention and signatory conventions that oversee and therefore govern such things as biological weapons? Do we need to revisit these treaties in ways that are more ethically sound and or that are more legally binding? And what does that then mean for the nature of the field, particularly when you have true dual usability, that a device that can be used to modify cognitions, emotions, and behaviors towards identifiable medical ends, where something is defined to be, quote, wrong, in other words, a recuperative or therapeutic engagement, might also be seen as affording hope for continued health, operational protection, and enablement of those individuals whose occupation it is to put themselves or to be put in harm's way for national and political agenda and incentives, such as those that are engaged by bellicose actions and intelligence. So fuzzy zones, once again, I think what it does is it deepens the need for particularity, for specifics, and for standpoint and orientation in the discourse and dialectic. Back to you.
Absolutely. Hear, hear. So on that, I see we've gotten to 3:20. So what I think we should definitely do now is shift to the second aspect of our discussion, which is building neuroethics for the brain stimulation journal community. And so what we, with Shirley and Maram and Harold, and the idea here was to have this special issue as a launching point to start to develop communication on these kinds of topics within the journal itself. But not to just necessarily leave it just with that, but to see what might be a kind of a continuing sort of forum or activity that could continue to hopefully attract more people interested in the topic to this kind of discussion. And one could throw out a bunch of ideas. Could there be a sort of a standing editorial or other discussion in the journal that would tackle some of these topics? Another option might be something more of the type we're doing here, which is maybe an interview series or podcast series where we could maybe Jim and I interview scientists or engineers to probe neuroethical, legal, social policy issues that they are curious about as possibly emanating out of their work. We could also, for example, invite the broader journal community to submit short comments on a central theme raised in each of these sessions. There are journals that I could refer you to that deploy this kind of strategy well. The American Journal of Bioethics, for example, has a target article, which is a full length article, but then the community is invited to submit quite short, 1.5 to 2-page comments on it. And you can often get a collection of voices brought to bear on a given issue. So that's another possible model that could perhaps galvanize interest and maybe engagement with some of these issues for the journal. So I guess what I'd like to do is throw it open to all of you to hear more about what you think would attract the community, the brain stimulation community, and provide value for the brain stimulation community.
So I'll chime in. I really like the idea of having a sort of a multi-pronged approach and article, as well as we all, even on the current session here, current call, we are all from very different disciplines, and just a disciplinary perspective, I think, would be very, very beneficial in terms of how we use brain stimulation in our field, and what our concerns are in terms of ethical and legal guidelines.
Yeah, a couple of points. One is, I think it would be very useful to have some practical output ultimately recommendations on what types of ethical issues should be considered by authors that are submitting to the journal. Not necessarily do's and don'ts, but what is it that you need to address at least? What do we need to know about your study from an ethical point of view to evaluate it properly? Basically the only area where, as a group, we really can regulate is the journal itself and the information that we process. So there, I think we can have some practical output as to whether there is some general principles that need to be considered for papers. And another dimension that wasn't.
Harold, can I ask you about that?
Yeah.
Are you thinking like, here's a checklist, and when you submit a paper, these items should be mentioned in your methods so that we.
Or if they're relevant, discuss. We all require that that there be a statement about human subjects and IRB approvals and ethical, but there are larger ethical issues. Is this cosmetic or is this therapeutic? Is the intended use for this, to advance human skills that can be used in particular ways that's been discussed that might be belligerent or not? These are sort of larger questions that we never really raise in the papers themselves, that some sensitivity to these types of issues might help raise consciousness within the journal. And the next issue is sort of at the heart and at the same time tangential. Part of the field of brain stimulation is highly experienced with having a built-in antagonistic audience. So the most regulated medical procedure in the world is ECT, right? And that also has a built-in anti-group, which has massively funded lawsuits against the industry, essentially tied to bring the industry down, mostly with fake information. This has now started with TMS. There's now a website for TMS side effects, and Mad in America is essentially presenting false information about TMS to influence the public. Much of what we've been concerned with, in terms of our national politics, is being played out in terms of these types of brain stimulation technologies, or maybe played out. And that also raises a whole different, people, when I speak to the head of FDA or NIH, they will say, this is internal terrorism, but we don't do anything about it, right? That these people are shaping the industry, basically, for ideological reasons. And so that's another set of types of ethical issues that impact on this field, and which I think have very real practical consequences.
Giordano, let me throw another possibility out to the group and to those who are listening, and that is to sort of identify, as you said, Harold, some key ethical themes, ethical legal themes that are very, very germane, not only in terms of their sort of philosophical import, but to their applied value and gravitas. In other words, things that are tractable. Right? Are there issues of autonomy, etc.? Yes, of course they are. But what does that actually mean when we look to translate autonomy into clinical practice and value? Are we going through all the necessary contingencies, for example, for consent, and based upon that, the individual exercising autonomy to that point of being able to engage, quote, the device? What then does it mean to be, and I'm going to be very tongue-in-cheek, to be a cyborg, to be an individual who has some form of cybernetic device that allows for relative control, more autonomy or less? And what does that actually mean? The other issue is to really then begin to cultivate a viable, if you will, market within the journal for not only qualitative ethical, legal, and social papers, but those that are more empirical, that actually engage in methods, mixed methods, that utilize narratives, reports, polls, surveys, to be able to assess key user, share, and stakeholder groups' attitudes, values that may be very influential to shaping the very type of discourse and either implicit or explicit influence that you've described. So I think here too, we have some viability to be able to define the journal as a nexus and forum for these discourses, and to be able to at least provide some suggestions into those key silos of high interest that may be of not only high viability, given the state of the science and technology, but real value to contribute to those necessary informative processes that may actually serve to guide and govern its use in real world practices. Back over to you, sir.
Harold, I think there are the malicious actors, right? I mean, people, I don't know if they see themselves that way, but then many of us will see them as moving things in very much in the wrong direction and spreading misinformation. There's also not bad actors who are maybe still holding back the field. I know one researcher led a trial. She wanted to run a therapeutic, trial on therapeutic neuromodulation in children. And she happened to have changed institutions, and something that was routine at her initial institution was basically banned at the next institution by sort of over an IRB with very different standards, to the point that, and then the trial was stopped, and, that has its costs. I mean, that is another dimension to it, where people, so you see there's a backlash, people who don't understand. And so we don't want to be flippant with what we do and with the ethics of it, but there's also this notion that ignorance can lead to rules that are not conducive to good research.
And Maroma, I think that's a great point. But then on the other side, for some of the folks here on IRB who may not be familiar with the advances or the details about neuromodulation, should there be something, some kind of a training, if you will, for the end user that can potentially, what kind of training should a physician or a clinician have to demonstrate that they indeed can provide this kind of, say we're talking about transcranial electrical current stimulation or a TMS or any of those things? Would it just be, can it be an office tech or a student, versus you have to have some understanding of the whole process? How do we convince the IRBs at institutions where they're not very familiar with it, just to avoid that kind of a backlash, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a strong advocate that people should be trained in the equipment that they're using. And sometimes, I mean, when it's a medical procedure that comes with its own automatic regulations, hopefully, right, about that are implemented. In the case of research, that may not exist, right? You can buy a piece of equipment, hand it off to an undergraduate, and tell them to go stimulate there's ethical review, but the IRB may not ask a question about have people using the equipment been trained. And going back to Harold's point, when an article arrives at the journal, we don't ask, whether the people who use this equipment, were they trained? There's certain, you're just assuming certain things, and I don't know how. I know what the answer is, but that certainly could be something else that we could talk about as far as certifying users, and a technique that is considered low risk is not a technique that does not to be trained on. It's low risk because it's low risk, because it's done in a certain way, and everything does not go. And I think that message does get lost a lot. And I know for a fact, not across different countries, across different labs just in the US, there could be massive differences in the level of training and certification and monitoring that they apply.
And Maram, as I'm listening to you both, I'm thinking also that it would be important to understand the source of the discomfort of the IRB in the case you described. Did it have to do with uncertainty about training of the researchers, or instead did it have to do with, for example, lack of evidence on long-term use of stimulation on the developing brain? That this is your field, the state of the evidence, but if it were the latter, then it would seem to me that the response to that would be to have some form of concerted effort on, like, a meta-analysis, systematic review, gathering the data, and also at the same time sort of doing a little bit of an adjunct ethical analysis of when it's okay and when it's not okay to proceed under uncertainty, assuming that there are some gaps in the data. So that's another way to respond if in fact the concern was of a second type.
Yeah, the concern, I'm not an ethicist, but it's something that I call banana arguments, because you can apply them to bananas. It'd be something like, well, you can't do that, you can't do this intervention. Maybe it's TDCS, or maybe it's eating one banana a day, because no one has ever done a 20-year longitudinal trial on whether this will cause their pinky to spontaneously combust after 5 years. It's just some sort of abstraction, right? And not only is there no clinical reason to suspect it, there isn't even a theoretical reason, meaning you can't point to an animal trial. You can't point to a theoretical study. It's just sort of like this abstract notion, like in the case of children, you would say, well, and I mean, this is a real concern. I'm saying, children's brains are developing. And so anything that affects their brains could affect development. And so you could just say, based on that, we're not going to allow anything to go. And so it's often arguments like that are very hard to respond to, right? You can't, there's no evidence. The evidence it suggests that it is safe. There's a extensive evidence that suggests that it's safe, but you can't, disprove something that never happened, kind of thing. And so that's where it gets into, and that's at least in this case, and I've seen in other cases where it's like these banana arguments where it's hard. And by the way, the researchers are guilty of this too, right? We publish papers where we call for caution, where we shouldn't have called for caution. It's a fine line where you draw. So maybe it's not always so simple, but often it's just it's a very difficult concern to address because it's not grounded in anything you can address.
I think complicating the situation, Maram, is the fact that often the side effects and risks of the brain stimulation technologies are apples and oranges compared to pharmacology. That how do you evaluate the relative risk of a sexual side effect or a metabolic syndrome against memory loss? That when they have totally different domains of side effects, from an ethical point of view, how do you relatively weight them? And that's something that we do all the time. We have to. We compare treatments and their risks and benefits. Yet the risks often are of a totally different nature.
Reflecting on this discussion, we were coming at this with what do we do to build neuroethics for brain stimulation journal? And it seems to me that what this discussion has demonstrated is there is an issue. There's an existing sort of uncertainty or impediment to the research or around pediatric applications. And this makes me think, how do we surface the other issues that are in the minds of the readership? Is it worthwhile doing some sort of like survey or some sort of call for proposals for topics that would be of interest to the readership? And that would help to give a little bit of direction on the kinds of focuses that we would take for a periodic, like a couple times a year, like a targeted focus at a particular issue. And we could bring together some experts who've looked at the ethics of pediatric neurostimulation research, for example, to have a bit of a targeted discussion about how one deals with these things and whatever other issues are identified.
I like that idea because I think what it does is it provides us, those of us who are working at and with the journal, the capability to exercise top-down control. In other words, we're open to this. We'd like to do this. We see the need for it, the importance for it, if not the necessity for it. But in that top-down control, you're inviting bottom-up participation. Okay, this has to be the nexus in the forum for that, but with what shall we populate that forum? And I think, Jen, your idea of putting out a request for papers or request for ideas, which we can then congeal into distinct calls for requests for papers, really opens it up to our audience of not only current readership, but potential readership in and across a variety of disciplines, some of them that have not necessarily contributed to the journal in the past, but that also allows for an inter and multidisciplinarity that I think is important to the discourse. So I'm all for that. I think, pulsing the readership, so to speak, provides some unique opportunities to view what they value, what they'd like to see, and in that way, increases not only the value of the journal, but its popularity amongst those user groups.
In general, I think researchers, myself and others do, when we're deciding what we should or should not do or dealing with a regulator will pull up papers. Like here's, you're worried about this. Well, here's a consensus review on the safety. Here's a consensus review of the tolerability in children. So those papers are valued by the community for that sort of reason that we can reach to them. Maybe where the gap is that those papers tend not to so much get into the ethics. They're just very matter of fact. How many side effects did we have here? And how they don't, to Harold's point, they don't compare it with anything else. They don't get into the ethical issues of what you should do next. And so I would say there's maybe a small gap for more just technical reviews by, the same cast of characters who conducted the trials versus maybe something else, which maybe takes that and builds on it and actually addresses some of these legal and ethical issues. And so now it becomes that much more valuable to people who need to reach for something for guidance.
Agreed. No, I think what it does is it puts, if you will, the locus of control back into those authors and those groups who are able to steer those conversations and those discourses about the ethical, legal, and social issues in those ways that are going to be germane to those other user groups who are actually doing the science, or perhaps even going one step further, that are considering developing guidelines and policies. So I like that idea a lot.
A related consideration is that the field of brain stimulation largely started by working with the most difficult patients. That's where the technologies were first applied. And in many ways, that was a mistake. TMS is a really good example of where it deliberately, the first trials were in treatment-resistant depression. And yet the patients who may benefit the most are the non-resistant, the side effects are amenable with it being used as and now it's moving into the first line. And there's never been guidance at all, as far as I know, explicit statement. For instance, I'm starting some work where we're putting shunts in the brain and sending a drug directly to the hippocampus and the amygdala to treat very, very severe PTSD. Right? The neurosurgical approach, drug delivery to a spot. Now, clearly, there has to be some consideration as to what patients would be appropriate for that and what not. Where do you stage these interventions, and what level of disability or what level of treatment failure and so on justify the use? And particularly since we are coming more and more towards these novel applications, there's virtually nothing that's written about when you use these applications in what population, what restrictions there should be.
I love that point, Harold. And then to push from the other way, right? There are some, like the thing about TDCS, there are some technologies that were first developed on healthy subjects.
Right.
That, young college students would be typically it, and were considered safe there. And so now you're taking something considered so low risk that you could use it on healthy college students, and you're asking, and now you're thinking about using it for therapeutic reasons, and you're pumping the brakes on that, right? So it's kind of like coming the opposite way. Like, why are we, you're withholding something from people who are really sick when you're okay using it on people who ultimately who literally have no benefit from having it done to them.
And what that then does is that brings us back, I mean, if not full circle, at least back to the 270 of the 360, which is what is the value of utilizing these approaches, particularly those that are non-invasive, for those ways to keep individuals healthy, or to at very, very least, keep them more resistant and or resilient to the actual effects, the objective signs and many of the subjective symptoms of an extant disease for which there is no cure. So once again here, I think there's the issue of when do we utilize these techniques and technologies in terms of what represents a clinical algorithm. And this is a point, Maram, you and I, we've made this point in the past with regard to certain forms of transcranial electrical stimulation, that it may be that earlier is actually of greater benefit than later, not necessarily once an individual becomes treatment resistant, but recognizing an early component of treatment or at least intervention might be the use of these techniques and technologies in those ways that allows maximal opportunity for the existing non-degenerated brain parenchyma to respond, to gain some level of functional, if not structural plasticity, and therefore to be able to be more tractionable, maintaining a higher quality of life before we run out of options. So here too, Here's a practical issue that has broad ethical, legal, and social import. So again, I think what this is very reinforcing for is these are the types of points that I think would be very both evocative to the audience and provocative to the readership to be able to engage the kind of discussions that would be very important and really, really very articulated in real world fashion.
Yeah, and I like very much this idea of hearing from those who are doing this research, because I sit off in my law faculty with my law students. I don't have the kind of close connection. I hear the issues through people like you and people who are writing for brain stimulation. And so in identifying what are the things that are occupying people's are concerning people, that gives us our signposts to what we need to do.
Yes, and I'd like to add that I'm an early career researcher, but a long time clinician in speech language pathology. And I work with people with autism, which is a whole other set of ethical concerns. And so I feel like my concerns are different as a new person. And I'm hoping that I've been listening, and I've followed neuroethics for a little while in this area. And it's just so complicated, and I think it can be very intimidating. And there are so many points to make. Someone like me may feel, not as confident raising my concerns, but I certainly have a bunch of concerns. Just like where is the guidance internationally? Where's the guidance? What is the state of that? Do we have some sort of are we planning a United Nations of brain stimulation or some kind of thing like that? What is it? Judica and I have talked about this too. What is the path for some sort of certifying body so that not every person clinically can go out and start stimulating people in their practices, like we see in neurofeedback? It's like I know so many people doing neurofeedback who aren't trained very well and they're doing it, and I really don't want to see that with stimulation. And so some of those are my concerns as a newer researcher and also someone who works clinically.
Yeah, and Joan, I've had similar conversations with Shirley Fecteau expressing similar kinds of concerns. That's how I sort of got into this, was through Shirley. And to answer your question, I was last week in Paris at an OECD meeting. They have, over the last couple of years, developed a series of principles for neurotechnology, ethical principles for neurotechnology. Now, the difficulty with these kinds of high-level consensus principles is they tend to be articulated at a level of generality that allows them to be applicable across every possible case. So yes, we want autonomy, and we want informed consent, and we want safety, and we want privacy. What does that actually mean in specific concrete cases is left to be filled in. And so what we have a need for something intermediate, or something that's case-based, where we identify particular really difficult cases, and then we dig in to actually bring home to roost what those principles mean in that case. That otherwise we end up, at this level of generic principles that nobody can disagree with, but don't provide people a heck of a lot of guidance. So I think there's a real room to try to populate that middle zone. It can only be done in an interdisciplinary way, because we need the people who do ethics and law to be in communication with people who actually know the basic facts about the technology and its application to do that properly. Well, you know what? It's 3:52. I would just say how much of a pleasure it's been to be here with you. And I hope this was interesting and useful. I learned a couple of things, and I've taken the 3 pages of notes. I hope if we can ask for your help, everyone who's here, to circulate information about this call for papers. We want to make this a big success and a good launching pad for development of neuroethics discussion for the community. And maybe I could ask for Harold or Merrim or Judica, or all 3, to say a few closing words, because I think we're coming nearly to the hour.
Harold or Merrim, you want to start us off?
I was kicking the ball to Merrim.
Oh, Jen and Jim, thank you. I knew you would do a great job, but it was extremely stimulating. Yeah, and again, yeah, as was already reminded, we hope that the special issue is not sort of the beginning and the end, but something that we generate a lot of other activities and discussions around. And so I do like that theme very much. So thank you.
Yeah, I also want to thank both of you and to indicate that this is really an opportune time for these issues to come out, because this is really the infancy of this field, and it is a new field of medicine, and it is growing at a remarkable rate. The opportunities are phenomenal. In the next few years, we're going to see massive changes in how we treat neuropsychiatric disease because of the developments in this field. So it's wise to, at this stage, sort of lay out what the major ethical issues are that we have to confront. And I would really encourage that we have some concrete product at the end, something that we can use to help guide the evaluation of papers in the journal. That, you know, had they consider this topic or this issue as it might pertain, because then people will take notice. So thank you again.
I agree, Harold, and that's a guidance that authors would look at when they're preparing their work. It's a guidance that editors would use. It's a touchstone that the reviewers could use. So they're like, oh, we're supposed to look at this. Okay, well, now I'm going to ask the authors about this, because brain stimulation is asking that we make sure that these conditions are met. Yeah.
And I think that's great as well, because for the newcomers to the field to have a little bit of a guidance in terms of both ethical as well as the legal aspects of it as they start. And Joan and I had several conversations about, where to begin, what should we be considering, and that especially as the field grows and we invite different disciplines as to be part of this, it helps to develop the confidence and the sense of competence that you are indeed doing the right thing when there is some amount of guidance to follow. So thank you so much, Jen and Jim and Marome and Harold and everybody on the call. This was a fabulous beginning for those journal clubs. I'm hoping the discussion and the conversation will not end here. And we continue to have several of these. We are planning on setting these up on a regular basis. And I'm hoping we can, y'all will be participating in the future sessions as well.
Thanks, everybody. See you at the next one.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
you.
So long.
Bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.